Hi everyone, it's Dr. Hall, and today we're going to go through the structures of the heart. So right now we're looking at a very large model of the heart, and what we need to remember is that this is the anterior surface. So this is the patient's right side over here, left side over here. So when we look at the anterior surface of the heart, our right side of the heart, we have our right atria over here, right atrium, right ventricle. Left atrium, left ventricle. And you can see that the most anterior large vessel, we call these the great vessels, the most anterior great vessel of the heart is this one coming out of the right ventricle, which is the pulmonary trunk, which is then going to subdivide into pulmonary arteries going out to each lung. Coming out from just posterior to that, we can see the aorta and our three branches off the aortic arch, the brachiocephalic trunk, left common carotid, and left subclavian arteries. And then of course the descending aorta continuing posteriorly. So when we look at the anterior surface of the heart, we also see these little flappy things. And years ago when they were naming the parts of the heart, they thought these looked like little ears sticking off the atria. And so they called them auricles, A-U-R, because oral means of the ear. So we have a right auricle, a left auricle hanging off of the right and left atrium. When we look at the anterior surface of the heart, we also see this groove here between the two ventricles called the anterior interventricular, because inter means between, sulcus, which just means groove. In that groove, we see an artery coming down to supply the heart muscle. This is called the left anterior descending artery, sometimes also called the anterior interventricular artery. Either term is correct. This is going to supply the muscle of the left ventricle predominantly. We also see a vein that is coming up and draining blood away from the heart muscle. This is the great cardiac vein here. If we look a little bit over toward the right ventricle and we say, well, who's supplying the right ventricle? We can see the right coronary artery right here, which is coming around. It's also in a groove that's the groove between the atria and the ventricles, and that groove is called the coronary sulcus. So this is the right coronary artery coming out and sending branches to supply the right ventricle. Primary among them is this one here, which is called the marginal branch of the right coronary artery. If we look a little bit more closely now to see where this left anterior descending artery is coming from, I'm going to tip it so hopefully you can see it's just this little tiny stub of a left coronary artery. It bifurcates very high up into the left anterior descending, and then it sends another one that circles around the posterior side of the heart, and that is called the circumflex artery. So the left coronary artery is very, very small and short because then it bifurcates into the left anterior descending and the circumflex arteries. If we look at the posterior surface of the heart, we can see, so now that I'm looking at the posterior surface, this is the right side, this is the left side. So we can see our great cardiac vein coming around the back, and that's going to drain blood into the coronary sinus. It's weird, the word sinus can just mean a big collection place. So it's going to dump into the coronary sinus, which is then going to drain into this chamber of the heart, which is the right atrium. So the right atrium is receiving venous used up blood from the body as well as the heart muscle. And so it's receiving blood from the inferior vena cava, from the coronary sinus, and from the superior vena cava here. So this is the right atrium. This over here is the left atrium. And the left atrium, of course, receives oxygenated blood from the lungs via the pulmonary veins. So we have two on each side, two here and two here. These are the pulmonary veins bringing oxygenated blood from the heart. That's why they're red, oxygenated, even though they're veins, because the definition of a vein is it brings blood back to the heart. Pulmonary veins draining into the left atrium. This is the trachea, so you can see how the aorta relates to the trachea. And here, these little blue structures here and here, those are those pulmonary arteries taking blood out to the lungs. So now let's look at the interior of the heart. So if I open it up, we can see some really interesting structures. So first of all, let's reorient ourselves. Here's our superior vena cava receiving blood from the two brachiocephalic veins draining into the right atrium, which is also receiving blood from the inferior vena cava and the coronary sinus. So blood comes into the right atrium, and then it's going to move through this valve here, which is called the tricuspid valve because it has 3 leaflets to it, and the blood will move into the right ventricle. The right ventricle has very thick muscle layers compared to the atrium because it's going to actually do a lot of pumping, right? And so when the right ventricle contracts, we want to make sure that none of the blood goes backwards back into the right atrium. So this valve is going to slam shut and be kept from blowing backwards by these little strings called chordae tendineae, which are held down by these strong muscles called papillary muscles. So right atrium, tricuspid valve, right ventricle, papillary muscles, chordae tendineae, these tendinous cords that hold the valve, prevent it from blowing out backwards. We also see this strange texture to the muscle inside both ventricles actually, and that's called the trabeculae carnae. Trabeculae because they look like trabeculations, like girders going every which way. Carnae because carne means muscle or meat. So when the right ventricle contracts, then the blood is going to move, and here's the other part of the right ventricle here, up through the pulmonary valve, and I know that's the pulmonary valve because this is the pulmonary artery because it's blue, the pulmonary valve, and out to the pulmonary trunk, right? And then out to the lungs. It's going to come back from the lungs via the pulmonary veins that enter the left atrium, go through the mitral or bicuspid valve into the left ventricle, where again we have papillary muscles and chordae tendineae. When the left ventricle contracts, it's going to send blood up through the aortic valve and up into the ascending aorta, aortic arch, and then all of the arteries you've learned about. What we can also see here are 2 little arteries that come off right at the very beginning of the aorta. Those are the origins of the right coronary artery and the left coronary artery. So we saw earlier when the right coronary comes out, it travels here in this space between the right atrium and right ventricle. There's your right coronary artery, and your left coronary artery goes just a little ways before branching into the circumflex and the left anterior descending. So there's the heart for you.